So I heard you're a munch.
No, that is absolutely false.
False allegation.
False. Me beating the munch allegations.
Who would have thought? Not I. But we're back. Episode 3 Wine for
Oh
Real
boy.
People. Continuing our discussion of wine production, moving on to sparkling wine today. Shouldn't be too long of a topic, but let's just cut the semantics and get right into it. A little chart before you, just going over some labeling terms that you might see in the EU. The ones in bold they're really important ones. Just talking about the different levels of sugar. You'll have a low being that brut natural or bruto natural in Italy. These are just different ways to say the same thing, just depending on what country you're in. That's going to be around 0 to 3 grams of sugar per liter. That's your residual sugars. Your brut style, 0 to 12, and then your demi-sec style, which is getting into the more semi-sweet category, from all the way to 32 to 50 grams of sugar per liter residual.
And underneath that, we have a cool little diagram that shows the general process of creating sparkling wine. Of course, we will be getting into this in much more depth later on. So, of course, after harvest, we have to press and juice. Again, the word fractioning comes up. That's a thing we mentioned in yesterday's video, that juice in between presses gets like sometimes sectioned off in fractions to be blended later on. Then you have the settling and your first alcoholic fermentation. A lot of winemakers have to make the choice whether or not they want their sparkling wine to undergo malolactic fermentation, but that's not a required step. After that, you have your racking and your blending. So the fractioning is coming back, and you create your blend. Then you stabilize and you filter out everything, all the gunk that gets in there. Then you add your liquor de triage and your yeast inoculum, and thus undergoes secondary fermentation. During that secondary fermentation is where you get the actual bubbles as CO2 dissolves into the physical wine liquid itself. And once the yeast eats all its nutrients and its sugars and whatnot, it falls dead and on the bottom and collects as sediment on the bottom of the bottle. Then you age on the lees, and that's creating flavors of bread, biscuits. That's where you get all like the toast stuff from. Then my favorite word, riddling. Try saying that 5 times fast. But traditionally, it would be like some guy in a cave who
should have had a picture of the guy in the cave.
Yeah, we should have a picture of a guy in a cave who like takes a bottle and like raises it up just a little bit every day. But now we have more modern ways of riddling to get that sediment of the dead lees to the top of the bottle in order to disgorge, where then all of that yeast stuff comes out. It is topped off with dosage liquor, and it is corked, labeled, and sent to customers.
Then we're good to go. So that's an overview of the traditional method. We see that a lot in champagne. And just some useful vocabulary words. You heard James just mention liqueur de triage, which is essentially just a mixture of wine, sugar, yeast, and yeast nutrients, as well as a clarifying agent that gets added to the wine. I believe just before secondary fermentation.
Yeah,
right
it's
before
after blending, but before secondary fermentation.
Right before you're about to cork and create your sealed environment for the CO2 to integrate into the wine. Then you'll also see liqueur de expedition, which is wine and sugar essentially in a slurry together. You top this off after wine. Essentially, this is what's in reference to as dosage. You'll hear us say later, just different ways to say the same thing. So that was a brief overview on the traditional method. We're going to get more into that when we get down here, but let's talk about some other methods first. You'll see this a lot in a lot of up-and-coming wine stores or restaurants. This ancestral method, which I at first saw and I was like, what? What on earth could the ancestral method of wine look like? And then I did a little research, and it's essentially just what they do for pet nats, Pétillant Natural, which is a single fermentation sparkling wine, generally low to medium alcohol. It ends up being, and what you're doing is you're encouraging your fermentation, and then halfway through your fermentation, your primary fermentation, because it only goes through one fermentation cycle, unlike other sparkling wine methods where you have your primary and then your secondary. you bottle halfway through this first fermentation, you cap it off so that you have your CO2 integration within your primary fermentation, creating your carbonation level. So this is generally sold as a young wine because you're generally selling this as a young wine. Why would you sell this as a young wine, James?
Just because of the lifespan, just it's single fermentation. You want it young to preserve the flavors of the wine itself. As such, you'll see many pet nats, a telltale sign, at least when I worked in a wine store, one of the telltale signs for me was that the bottle is cloudy. That's because pet nats may or may not be disgorged, meaning that there is going to be that it's aging on the lees in the bottle still. The winemaker did not choose to remove it after the fact. Moving on to the tank method, and this is primarily used in intense varietals for like fruit-forward sparkling wines such as Prosecco. So we'll see it a lot there. It maintains the flavors of the base wine. So in general, this wine does not go through malolactic fermentation, and the secondary fermentation occurs in a sealed tank that is like specifically designed to handle all the CO2 that's going to be produced through this secondary fermentation. Once that's pretty much done, the wine is filtered and then bottled under pressure to preserve the CO2 that's integrated into the wine. And autolysis is not done typically, but paddles may be used to stir the lees to reinforce secondary characteristics of, like, if you want bread or toast notes in there. But typically it's not done in tank method wines.
So that takes us to another. These are two not necessarily as common methods. So the transfer method is essentially you take a method champenois, the traditional method that we talk about. You take it up to the point where you're ready to riddle your bottles and disgorge the lees from the bottle. You essentially take out the lees from the bottles, and then you filter the wine through a filtering process through streamlines under pressure so that you're maintaining your carbonation. You filter this wine, and then you transfer it and bottle it into a fresh bottle after. So transfer method is named because you're literally transferring your wine from bottle to bottle. Then you'll use your liquid d'expédition, like we talked about, your dosage, essentially, to top your bottles up, same as you would do from the transfer, method champenois. So really the only difference here is what they're doing in between that riddling and disgorgement step.
Moving on, the Asti method. It's named after a place used in the Asti region of Piedmont in Italy. This is a single fermentation, and it leads to sparkling sweet wines. As the winemakers in Asti do not make actual base wine to start. Rather, they just ferment the juice straight up. And as such, like I said, this leads to sweet, low alcohol wines. And the fermentation can stop whenever the winemaker chooses, usually about 7 ABV. And at that point, the winemaker chills down the wine and then bottles and sells.
And usually at the chilling step, they'll also filter out the yeast so that a secondary fermentation doesn't occur, because you're still going to have a lot of residual sugars left from that fermentation since you're only sitting at around 7%. So as a winemaker, you really want to make sure that you're not turning that Asti method into something else that it's not supposed to be, taking it above that 7%, like James' method, like James mentioned. So we briefly touched on the traditional method before. So everything but the Asti method starts with a base wine. So you have to have your base wine, which for a classic region like Champagne has to be high in acid and has to be low in residual sugars in the actual grape. So you're going to be looking to pick at the precise moment when your grapes are ripe. So in a cool climate area, it's fairly easy to get a high acid, low sugar grape, but in a warm climate area, you may be looking to pick a little bit earlier before they're ripe, because you really don't want those green herbaceous flavors in your sparkling wine. You want to encourage those nice ripe flavors that the grape is known for. So we'll have blending, which is done for a couple of reasons. You'll have consistency to preserve sort of a style that the chateau or the house is known for. You want to blend for balance so that your flavor profiles and your characteristics and your acid levels, your alcohol, your sugars are all balanced and uniform. And then you want to blend for complexity. There might be some characteristics in one even fraction of a press that might be drastically different from a different fraction of that same press. And you want to make sure that you're blending to make sure that no one part of your whole wine is overpowering, I'd say, something to that effect.
After we blend, we undergo secondary fermentation. Your liquor de triage is added, and that encourages the yeast to start up again. And the CO2 then integrates into the wine, creating the sparkle in this step. Like I said before, once the yeast eats up all of its nutrients and sugars, it begins to die and settles to the bottom of the bottle. And then the wine is allowed to sit on the lees, or you see in the notes that we have sur lie, as you say it in French. And as it sits, the lees physically breaks down, releasing chemical compounds into the wine that create the bread flavors. Typically, autolysis lasts 4 to 5 years. There's been cases where it's lasted up to 10. It's really dependent on the winemaker how long they want this to go.
So we move on to the stage where we have our bottles. They're sitting just about horizontally so that the lees have as much contact with the surface of the wine as possible, and you would have that sitting in, I guess, not the neck, but the main body of the actual bottle itself. And then once you're ready to get that bottle ready for sale, you're slowly going to start day by day. If you're a guy in a cave, you're going to turn and agitate your yeast in your bottle, slowly moving on an angle downwards day by day. How long you think that usually takes if they're doing it by hand?
Months.
A couple months, because you really it's micro movements, because you really just want to gradually encourage the gravity in the cave to bring the yeast down to the neck of the bottle to the point where you can then disgorge, which is a process of super chilling the neck of the bottle where all the yeast is lying. And you flip it right side up, and the pressure in the bottle shoots the hardened, disgorged lees out of the bottle, and then you quickly cork, cage, foil, or before that you would perform dosage so that you are making sure that you have enough actual liquid in your bottle, because that disgorgement takes out a good chunk of the volume in your bottle. So you want to disgorge, make sure that you're at 750 milliliters or whatever you're serving your bottle size in. You foil, you cork, cage, foil, label.
Yeah, and the funny thing about if you notice buying sparkling wine in a store, you notice that the foils on these wines are actually much larger and longer. They like go down the bottle a lot more than other foils of other bottles. This was actually just because of the disgorgement stage, where let's say if a bunch of people were to, in the olden days, a bunch of people were to like compare bottles of wine, like, oh, why is mine filled up this much and the other one is like this much? It's really to hide how much wine is in there, so it looks consistent. And then you get to age and bottle. Most sparklings are non-vintage, so it's difficult to determine the age of these wines.
So some different sparkling wine styles. We're going to touch on a couple. We just talked about just this past second, non-vintage. So it's not necessarily a labeling term, but you'll see a lot of, or rather you won't see a lot of dates on sparkling wine bottles, especially coming out from Champagne, unless it was a particularly good year for that producer and their vineyard, in which you may have a vintage sparkling wine. But often this non-vintage variety is it's a good testament to what the producer is known for in terms of their sparkling wine production, because it provides the consumer with a baseline of what the total sum of their parts are in a general sort of statement. But like I said, if you're having your particularly good vintage, your acid is where it should be, your sugars are exactly where they should be, you may choose to make a vintage wine. And in a place like Champagne and most of the appellations, you can only be using 100% of one vintage. In some other appellations with not as strict rules, you may have the option to blend in a little bit of a different vintage into your main vintage wine.
Yeah, moving on to rosé wines. Sparkling rosés are certainly a big thing that come around every summer. Summer's starting to come, and it's rosé season, baby. So
Rosé all day.
Rosé sparkling can actually be made by blending white and red base wines, or through a very short maceration period when to extract the color from your grapes.
And I feel like that's how most people imagine that rosé is made. You just mix
you
a little
blend
bit.
it. I mean, that's what I thought
You just
before I
mix a
started
little
this
bit of
shit.
red and a little bit of white, you get the rosé.
Well, yeah, it just makes sense. It's basic color theory. But again, this color can actually be adjusted by the liquor de expedition, the dosage at the end. So if it's not dark enough, or if it's too red, you can change it during that stage. And some appellations only permit their rosé sparklings to be made through maceration. So none of this like blending stuff that we mentioned earlier.
So a couple more vocabulary words that you're going to see when you start to study sparkling wine and as you're reviewing, Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir. So these are both white sparkling wines, and the second, the word after the D is going to be the indication of what color grape is being used. So Blanc de Blanc is a white wine made from white grapes. Blanc de Noir, white wine made from black grapes. And then we'll just talk about a prestige cuvée, which is not necessarily a labeling term, but it generally describes the best wines in a producer's range. So premier being the best, in cuvée, what did we discuss cuvée meaning?
It's the blend. It's the cream of the crop.
Right.
And as such, prestige cuvée wines, if it's labeled on the bottle, these typically will demand a higher price.
Right. All right, that has been a little touch on sparkling wine. We'll get into the regions of sparkling wine production and where we're going to see a lot of sparkling wine in a later video, probably in a couple weeks. But
yeah, probably a couple weeks.
This has been Wine for Real People.
Keep it real, people. What's going on?
What is going on?